apparently declare India to be a Hindu Rashtra, or whether, the state governments within the region, even if whichever the party is, they wish to extract the minerals, they will use these enemies, they will create the enemies like the Naxalites or the Muslims, they will create a huge hype around them and actually not allow journalists to do their work and not allow the civil society to function. And this is exactly the use in order to repress the civil society and the journalists. And it's important that the entire fraternity needs to come together in order to challenge this, because there is a much bigger ulterior motive of the government to go ahead with this process of putting the media under complete siege. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now invite Mr. Daniel Bastard he's the Asia Pacific Director, Reporters Without Borders, and he's going to talk about the Press Freedom Index. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I want to express my deepest gratitude to the people behind the Asma Jahangir conference. I'm really impressed by the quality of the sessions of the debate here. I think it's a very precious moment and a precious conference. I'm going to try to talk about the three countries we're dealing with today, which are Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. And for that, I'm going to use the World Press Freedom Index. So it's basically this map. As you can see, the world has turned very red, and red means bad. More concretely, if we look at Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka, India and Sri Lanka is light red, and Pakistan is dark red, which means bad or very bad situation. Very concretely, out of 180 countries, Sri Lanka is ranked 146, India 150, and Pakistan is in position 157. If we look at Bangladesh, it's just behind at 162. So we see that these 3 or 4 countries are really tightly bunched in the last third of the ranking. And if we look into details behind this number, it's interesting to see on which points the situation is really bad or a little better. In order to come up with this ranking we do at Reporters Without Borders, we have developed 5 indicators about the way media and press freedom can thrive and flourish or can regress. So these 5 indicators are first the political influence over the media, the economic conditions in which the news are produced, then legislative framework, social and sociological factors, and last but not least, the security and safety of journalists. And when we look at this very last indicator, the security of journalists, this is the most weighty indicator in the score of India and Pakistan. Last year, 3 journalists were killed because of their job of reporting news. In Pakistan and India, the number is 4 journalists killed in 2021. So this is really preoccupying. This is the very harshest violence against journalists. Sri Lanka hasn't seen any dead journalists for a few years now, but it was really, really bad 10 or 15 years ago. And the physical attacks against journalists in Sri Lanka are very, very worrying as well. The second most preoccupying issue with press freedom in these 3 countries has to deal with political interference with media freedom. That's especially true in Pakistan with these repeated meddlings and crackdowns by the military establishment, the almighty military establishments against the media. That's really a serious concern, a long-term concern in Pakistan. These political problems are very much at stake in Sri Lanka as well, where the media are very polarized and often have to follow a line And the trend is less visible in India, but it's still very strong. I think it's just less seen in data because in our figures because of the diversity of the country, which is greater in India than in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. This political interference has to be corroborated with a very high level of concentration, of media concentration in all these three countries. The economic conditions under which the media and the news is produced in these three countries is still very problematic. On one hand, there is often a very strong leverage between big media houses and political parties and political leaders, and that's a big problem. On the other hand, grassroots journalists who work on the ground, live often in a very deep financial insecurity, with very low wages, very poor working conditions, or sometimes with some wages that are just not paid for months. And that's something that is really critical in Pakistan, notably. And in the end, this situation of strong economic influence over the media is very badly impacting the independence of newsroom and, of course, the plurality of viewpoints inside media houses. When you have one media houses which is clearly associated with one political parties, they would have some very partial view on other political parties. And very concretely, for journalists, for editors, for chief editors, they know that they have to follow a line that is imposed in some way by their media owner and their political affiliates. And these journalists, these editors, these chief editors, they also know that there are implicit red lines that should not be crossed. More or less implicit red lines, that's where the trick is. But I'm talking about political red lines. People in Pakistan are well aware of these red lines, like you cannot talk about the military very freely, you have to be very cautious. But I'm talking here about social red lines as well. Some subjects are clearly taboo in South Asia and in these three countries we're talking about today. We can take, for instance, the fate of Tamil people in Sri Lanka, the fate of Kashmiri in India, or ethnic or religious minorities in Pakistan, Christians, Hindus, Ahmadiyyas. And in the end, this leads to a misrepresentation of large parts of its country population, including minorities like Dalit or Adivasis in India, Muslim minorities in India and in Sri Lanka. But it also impacts the way gender minorities are reported in these countries. And this underrepresentation is also including not a minority, but a vast majority, which is the question of women's rights. Women-related issues are clearly underrepresented in South Asian media for two main reasons. First, women journalists still are much less represented in media houses, especially in executive positions, and also the subjects that are treated in the media are not really focused on women issue, except in some niche media that are really specialized in this issue. But in mainstream media, it's not so common to find really in-depth inquiries and investigation about the way women live in these free countries. Finally, this picture I've just drawn is a bit pessimistic. There is one striking point in these three countries, and that is what we have remarked in our World Press Freedom Index, is the legislative framework. In our data, the legislative framework is the indicator where the two countries perform the best. In each country's constitution or law, there are legal guarantees for the free flow and information, and it's not so common. For myself, I've been a correspondent in China during 6 years, and I can say that there is no legal guarantee at all in theory and in practice. So this is, I mean, South Asia has really something encouraging with these legal guarantees. But of course, the problem is the implementation of these guarantees. This is where the problem really stands. And this calls for action by relevant institutions to make sure that these guarantees are properly enforced and that in the end the rule of law is effectively enforced. I think that's really the key and what we have to work on with the judiciary here, which has proved very voluntary, as what I've seen in the debates. And this is very urgent because in all three countries the score in the World Press Freedom Index has been deteriorating for several years. So there is a clear regression of media freedom, which means there is a clear emergency to tackle all these problems. And we all need to act now, inside the country, outside, through confrontation, debate, cooperation, and exchange of viewpoints, so that the media will remain the fourth pillar of democracy, and I think this is really urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now be inviting our colleague from Sri Lanka. She's joining us virtually, Dilrukshi Handuneti. She's an international award-winning investigative journalist and lawyer from Sri Lanka. She will obviously talk about the challenges of reporting from conflict zones, as well as the kind of political and economic crises that the country has been going through and the challenges that it has thrown up for the people who are reporting on it. So I welcome Dilrukshi.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Is it possible to hear me?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. But I think after Daniel, there is very little to be said about Sri Lanka, perhaps. And he unpacked most of our countries in the region and why we are all looking very red. And as you all know, Sri Lanka does look very red, but I just listening to all four speakers, I felt that perhaps I should think about, explaining the situation in Sri Lanka, not only for reporters, not only for journalists who are covering the current crisis, but about the human rights situation in general as well. There was a popular uprising in April when Sri Lanka's escalating financial crisis spilled onto the streets of Colombo and then spread to elsewhere, which also was reflective of a very deep-rooted political crisis, a human rights crisis. Many crises were represented, but I would think that we were recognizing that Sri Lanka for long has been tolerating many things, and this includes probably the region's largest nepotism project. All of you know that Sri Lanka was, until recently, we had a massive family rule, and the protesters were able to get the former president Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign as a result of the protests. And then there was Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa who also stepped down. And the other Rajapakshas who were also holding office, different portfolios and in power in different forms, were all forced to step down from their duties at that time. But if you thought that Sri Lanka was going to rewrite history and to have a different story to tell, I think we can acknowledge the fact that we are not telling that different story. The Sri Lankan foreign minister was speaking, addressing the UN General Assembly just a few days ago, and he was speaking about freedom of expression and how important it is to have freedom of expression protected in Sri Lanka. We do know that we have leaders who speak about rights, who speak to the international community, and there is a separate lingo when you speak about the rights-based approach when you speak at such fora. But at the same time, on the same day, around the same time, 84 activists from Socialist Youth Forum were arrested. And to date, from the data I have, over 3,800 people have been arrested, all of them associated with the recent protests. And at least 1/3 of those people are still under detention. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what Sri Lanka is. And clearly, these arbitrary arrests, the harassment, continuous harassment of journalists, artists, activists associated with the protests and months-long protests is an ongoing thing for Sri Lanka. The global condemnation has not done much to change the situation here. The cracking down on dissent still continues, and there is a clear witch hunt of the protesters, and people actually live in fear. People are scared to speak, freely express themselves, or to speak, share even posts on social media, because there is a lot of surveillance which people would not even want to acknowledge publicly anymore for the fear of reprisal. The public's demand for regime change was something that a lot of journalists, a lot of social media activists, the YouTube community in Sri Lanka, they have done a tremendous job in highlighting the situation in Sri Lanka. It cannot be separated. At a point, the journalists were part of that struggle, and in Sri Lanka, journalists were representing that voice. As a result, they were also at the receiving end. But the failure to govern and to commit such economic crimes as done in Sri Lanka is something that journalists should be discussing, should be raising. And also, instead of the witch hunt that we witnessed in Sri Lanka, it would have been probably ideal to have some kind of attempt to be made to recover the stolen assets, to ensure there is justice and fair pay. And I go back to something that Steve said about Sri Lanka, the fact that, and also Daniel, that there are no deaths, there are no killings of journalists, but it does not mean Sri Lanka is the perfect place, or it has never been really, because we've been one of the most violent places for journalists to live in and to work in. It changes for a while, but impunity has come to stay. And a case in point is that I would like to refer to the Permanent People's Tribunal. I just want to highlight this because it did deliver a very important verdict recently in The Hague about, and it held the Sri Lankan government responsible for what has happened. And I refer to the murder of my former editor, Lasantha Wickramatunge. And in this inquiry, there was something that I would like to mention, and the verdict did say that his right to life, freedom of expression, and effective remedy were all denied. And when it is not just about him, it's about all of us working in Sri Lanka, all journalists in Sri Lanka, and not working in Sri Lanka, not just in South Asia, but the rest of the world as well. Impunity is something that we as a region got to tackle. And this was an emblematic case only, that where we learn that the state can actually get to the messenger and take your life for speaking the truth. And because we also talk about media under siege, I also want to mention something that I thought would be appropriate, because this is also South Asian space. We do not have the opportunity to report on each other. Our narratives are largely constructed by different sections of the media. Sometimes it's deeply political. And listening to all of you, I felt the opportunity to report Pakistani journalists to visit India or Indian journalists to visit Pakistan and to understand and report on our people, on the issues that journalists or journalists face would not be possible. So who prevents us from having that access? Who prevents us from telling these stories is also something I think we should discuss. And that's also because when we talk about media undersea, this is also one way of controlling free speech of stories that matter about our own understanding of our region as well. I think I wouldn't want to take a lot of time simply because probably it's 2:08 in Colombo. Probably we can take some questions, and I think that you might want to ask questions about Sri Lanka rather than me offering a summary which is of my own.
Thank you. Thank you, Dilrukshi. Our last guest is Afzal Bhatt Sahab. He's the president of the PFUJ Pakistan, and he will now talk about some of the issues facing our journalists, especially in terms of their employment.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। सबसे पहले मैं आसमा जहांगीर फाउंडेशन को खराज तहसीन पेश करता हूँ कि जिन्होंने आज के इस घुटन के दौर में भी इतनी शानदार कॉन्फ्रेंस का इनेकाद किया और लोगों को बोलने का मौका दिया। हाल में बैठे हुए सब लोग क्योंकि पीएफजे की हिस्ट्री से वाकिफ़ हैं कि गुज़श्ता 70 साल से पीएफजे ने प्रेस फ्रीडम के लिए, शहरी आज़ादियों के लिए, जमहूरियत और जमहूरी इदारों के इस्तेहकाम के लिए एक तवील जद्दोजहद किया। उस पर बात नहीं करूँगा क्योंकि आज का हमारा मौजू है कि आजकल हम किस किस्म की पाबंदियों का सामना कर रहे हैं। तो आज जब हम माजी के हालात को देखते हैं तो मुझे लगता है कि जो अनाउंस सेंसरशिप थी वो बहुत बेहतर थी आज की अनअनाउंस सेंसरशिप के मुकाबले में। आजकल अनअनाउंस सेंसरशिप के लिए जो हथियार इस्तेमाल किए जा रहे हैं उनका आप लोगों को इदराक जरूर होना चाहिए। 4-5 किस्म के वेपन आजकल जर्नलिस्टों के खिलाफ इस्तेमाल हो रहे हैं। पहला हथियार पुराना है लेकिन इस्तेमाल अब ज्यादा हो रहा है कि जो जर्नलिस्ट बोलता है, लिखता है, बात करता है, उसके खिलाफ गैर अखलाकी मुहिम चला दी जाए, उस पर गैर अखलाकी इल्जामात की बौछार कर दी जाए ताकि उसकी कम्युनिटी उसको डिफेंड ना कर सके, ताकि सिविल सोसाइटी उसके साथ खड़ी ना हो सके, उसके करीबी अजीज उसके साथ खड़े ना हो सके। जिसकी वाज़ेह मिसाल इन 2 महीनों के दौरान भी हुई। मुल्तान में हमारे बहुत अच्छे जर्नलिस्ट हैं, शकील अहमद डॉन के ब्यूरो चीफ रहे, आजकल बेरोजगार हैं। उनके खिलाफ और अखबार के चीफ रिपोर्टर के खिलाफ एक खातून के अगवा का मुकदमा दर्ज कर लिया गया। पहले हम सोचते रहे कि क्या बात करें इसके ऊपर, कि जब एफआईआर शकील ने भेजी कि इस पर आप अपना रद्द-ए-अमल दें तो इंसान सोचता है कि लोग क्या कहेंगे, एफआईआर क्या है और ये मुतालबा क्या कर रहे हैं। बहरहाल जब बात की, मुल्तान के दोस्तों ने बहुत स्ट्रगल की और जिस चीफ रिपोर्टर को गिरफ्तार किया गया था उसको बेगुनाह करार देकर निकाला गया और पता चला कि ये एफआईआर सिर्फ इनको बदनाम करने के लिए और इनको खामोश कराने के लिए दर्ज की गई थी। अभी कल का वाकया है, 3 दिन पहले गुजरांवाला के एक जर्नलिस्ट के खिलाफ कुमारबाजी का झूठा मुकदमा दर्ज कर लिया गया है। उसे पहले उठाया गया, रात भर थाना अहमदनगर में बंद रखा गया, तशद्दुद किया गया। जब जर्नलिस्टों को पता चला, उन्होंने सोशल मीडिया पे कैंपेन शुरू की, तो उसके खिलाफ सुबह सवेरे कुमारबाजी का मुकदमा दर्ज कर लिया गया ताकि उसके मुतल्लिक कोई बात ना कर सके। या आजकल इस तरह के वेपन बड़े आम इस्तेमाल हो रहे हैं। दूसरा, वो भी पुराना हरबा है कि जो जर्नलिस्ट बोलता है, जो चैनल बात करता है, उस पर मुल्क दुश्मनी के इल्जामात लगा दे, ताकि सोसाइटी का और अवामी रद्द-ए-अमल के खिलाफ इतना हो कि उस प्रेशर के सामने वो उसके साथ ना खड़ा हो सके, तंजीमें उसके साथ खड़ी ना हो सके, सिविल सोसाइटी उसके साथ खड़ी ना हो सके। ये आम वेपन है जिसका जियो न्यूज़ को बहुत अरसा सामने रहा। हामिद मीर साहब आपके सामने बैठे हैं कि इन पर और दीगर वो जर्नलिस्ट जो बात करते थे, सबसे आसान होता था ये मुल्क दुश्मन है, ये मुल्क का गद्दार है, और ये इल्ज़ामात वो लोग फेस करते रहे। और आज फिर 2 माह पहले ARY के इस्लामाबाद के ब्यूरो चीफ खावर घुम्मन, डायरेक्टर न्यूज़ इमाद यूसुफ, उनके मालिक सलमान इकबाल और एक खातून जो एंकर थी, उनके खिलाफ भी बगावत का मुकदमा दर्ज किया गया और आज तक वो बेल पर हैं और इसको भोग रहे हैं। इस तरह के मुकदमात का और इल्जामात का भी मसला ये होता है कि एक आम आदमी जो पाकिस्तान के साथ मोहब्बत करता है, पाकिस्तान का वो शहरी जो पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ बात सुनना पसंद नहीं करता, जब उसको पता चलेगा कि किसी जर्नलिस्ट ने पाकिस्तान की दुश्मनी की साजिश कर ली है, तो उसके खिलाफ सोसाइटी में नफरत होगी और उनको उसके खिलाफ कार्रवाई में आसानी मिलेगी। और इसके अलावा तौहीन मजहब आम सा मामला है कि अगर आप किसी को तौहीन मजहब का, ब्लास्फेमी का इल्ज़ाम लगा दें, तो हमारे बहुत से बेगुनाह गैर मुस्लिम भी और मुस्लिम भी मारे गए सिर्फ उस इल्ज़ाम की वजह से। और आजकल नहीं, पहले आप जानते होंगे कि जब जियो को बंद किया गया था तो उसकी एक खातून एंकर के खिलाफ